Hi, this is Linda Remmers from HoopSisters, and today we have our Starburst block. This is our 8-inch Starburst block, and this is our 5-inch Starburst block. So let's show you now what you need to make the block. To make our Starburst block, we'll of course need our battleizer, and I've already got that in my hoop. We'll need fabric 1. I'm going to use white. My fabric 2 is green. My fabric 3 is purple. My fabric 4 is black. Then we need our backing fabric. For threads, you will need your thread B, which will be green. You will need your thread C, which will be purple. You'll need your quilting thread in the needle and the bobbin, and I'm going to use white on this block. And then you'll need a stem stitch thread, and I'm going to use black on this block. And of course, we also will always need our wash away thread. I just stitched my step number 1 onto my battleizer with a neutral thread. So for step 2, I'm going to change my thread out to the water soluble thread in the needle only, and I'll place fabric 1 in this little wedge right here. So I'll just make sure I cover it all up, and the machine will stitch a tack down stitch. Here's step 2, stitch down with the wash away thread, tack down my white fabric. So I'm going to trim outside edge. I'm going to leave about a ½ inch, and on the inside edge a scant ½ inch. And for step 3, I'm going to switch out to a neutral thread in the needle only. I'll take my fabric 2, place it right side to the white fabric, and it will stitch a seam. This is my seam from step 3. So now I'll take my fabric, I'll flip it right side out, finger press it. I can leave the same thread in the sewing machine. I do not have to change my threads. And step 4 will stitch a tack down stitch. This is my step 4. I just stitched my tack down stitch. So now I'm going to trim. Again, all inside edges are scant ½ inch on the inside of the block. And for step 5, I'm now going to take my thread B and put it in the needle only, and it'll do some decorative stitches. I just finished step 5 with my decorative stitches. So for step 6, I'm going to take my fabric 1 and I'm going to place it right side over the last seam, and it's going to stitch a seam. I'm going to use the same thread I've had in there all along, and then we'll flip it out. Here's my seam from step 6. So we take our fabric, we open it out and finger press it, and we switch out our thread to the wash away in the needle only, and the machine will stitch a tack down stitch. I just stitched step 7 with my wash away thread in the needle, so we're going to trim it ½ inch from the outside edge, scant ½ on the inside edge. My next step will be to switch to a neutral thread, and I'll take my fabric 2 and I'll place it right side to the white. I'll stitch a seam. Here's my seam from step 8. So now I will take for step 9 and flip my fabric right side out. I'll change my thread to the wash away thread, and the machine will stitch a tack down. Just completed stitching my step 9, which is the tack down stitch. So I need to trim again my fabric. Inside the block we're going to do a scant ½ inch. And this one doesn't really have an outside part, so we'll just leave it that way. And for step 10, I'm going to switch out my thread to a neutral thread, and I'm going to take my next fabric, which is number 1, place it right side to the green, and the machine will stitch a seam. Here's my seam from step 10. So for step 11, we'll open out our fabric, finger press it, smooth it out. We'll switch our needle thread to the water soluble thread, and the machine will stitch a tack down. Just finished sewing step 11 with the tack down stitch, so now we're going to trim, leaving a scant ½ inch on the inside of the block, and on the outside of the block about a ½ inch. That's step 11. For step 12, we're going to place another neutral thread in the needle. We're going to take our fabric 4 and we're going to place it right side to right over the fabric we just did, and we're going to stitch a seam. I just finished stitching the seam for step 12. It's hard to see on the dark fabric, Our next step is to open out the fabric, right side up, give it a finger press, and we'll leave the same thread in the machine, and it's going to stitch a tack down. So step 13, I did go ahead and do my tack down stitch. Now I'm ready to trim it. This is all inside edges, so we're going to do a scant 1/4 inch around all the stitching, just like that. For step 14, we're going to place a quilting thread in the needle only, and it's going to stitch right on top of my fabric 4. For step 15, I'm going to place fabric 1 right sides to the last fabric, and the machine will stitch my seam. For step 16, you're going to take your fabric you just sewed, the seam, and you're going to flip it right side up, finger press, smooth it out, switch your thread to the water soluble and the needle only, and the machine will stitch a tack down. This is my tack down from step 16, so I need to trim my fabric. Inside the hoop, a scant 1/4 inch is what we leave, about a 1/2 inch from the outside edge. Then for step 17, we're going to take our fabric 3, we're going to place it right sides to these 2 fabrics, like this. We're going to use a neutral thread in the needle, and the machine will stitch a seam. This is my seam from step 17. So now for step 18, we'll flip the fabric right side up, smooth it out. We'll leave the same thread in the needle, and the machine will stitch a tack down stitch. This is my tack down from step 18. Now I need to trim it, and again, like always, on the inside of the block we leave a scant 1/4 inch of fabric. This one doesn't really have much of an outside edge because there will be a seam there. And then for step 19, we're going to change to our thread C in the needle only, and it'll do a decorative stitch. There's my decorative stitching from step 19. For step 20, I'm going to place my fabric 1 right side to this last fabric, and I'm going to stitch my seam. Here's my seam from step 20. So for step 21, we're going to flip the fabric right side up, smooth it out. We're going to switch our needle thread only to the water soluble thread, and the machine will stitch another tack down. Here's my tack down from step 21. I've already trimmed my outside edge, leaving about a 1/2 inch. I'll trim my inside edge, leaving a scant 1/4 inch. For step 22, I'm going to replace my water soluble with another neutral thread in the needle, and I'm going to take fabric 3 and I'm going to put it right sides to the last one, and the machine will stitch a seam. This is my seam from step 22. So for step 23, we flip our fabric right side up, give it a finger press, and leaving the same thread in the needle, the machine will stitch another tack down. This is step 23 where I just stitched my tack down. So I'm going to do the same trimming I've been doing all along, scant 1/4 inch on the inside edge of the block. And then for step 24, I'll take my fabric 1, I'll place it right side over the last fabric, and the machine will stitch a seam. Here's my seam from step 24. So we're going to flip our fabric right side out, smooth it out, give it a little finger press. We'll switch out our needle thread to our wash away thread, and it will sew the tack down. This is my tack down stitch from step 25 with my wash away thread. The wash away thread will stay in the needle for step 26, and then for step 26 I'm going to take fabric 4, place it over the open area on the batting like this, and it will sew a tack down stitch. So here's my step 26 all stitched down. I went ahead and trimmed away the extra on the inside of the block here. It needs to be trimmed very close as if for applique. And for step 27, I'll put my stem stitch thread, in my case I've chosen black, in the needle only, and it'll cover the raw edge. My stem stitch from step 27 is completed. So now for step 28, we're ready to put our back on. So we'll turn our hoop over. We'll take your backing fabric and we'll spray a little temporary spray adhesive on the back side of it, and we'll center it over the stitching, and we will switch out our thread to the water soluble thread in the needle only, and the machine will baste the back on. So after my back is basted on in step 28, step 29 would be to place a the stem stitch thread in your needle and your bobbin, and go ahead and stitch the stem stitch part again. And then step 30, we're going to place your quilting thread, which I've chosen white in my needle and my bobbin, and stitch the quilting stitches. For both of these steps, it's a good idea if you have the feature where your machine has a thread cutter to turn off the thread cutter before doing these two steps. Here's our Starburst block, all done, quilted. We finished up step 30, which was our quilting thread in the white. So now we're ready to trim it. So like all of our blocks, if you're going to have an edge, like I'm going to say that this edge here is going to get binding, so I'm going to trim 1/4 inch from the basting line through all the layers. So I'm trimming through the top, the batting, and the backing. 1/4 inch from the basting line. So we'll say this is also going to be where the binding is going to go. On the other two edges, there will be no binding. These edges will be joined to another block. So for that, I'm going to use our Trimmer by George, which has a crimped edge. And that edge, we'll snug that up. We'll lift up this top fabric, snug that crimped edge under that fabric, lay it down, tug a little bit on the battleizer, and I'm going to be trimming off my batting and my backing. I'm going to do that on the other two sides. So now that that's trimmed off, that's what it looks like on the back. These two edges are for binding. These two edges will be joined to another quilt block. But the fronts also need to be trimmed, and they're going to be trimmed 1/4 inch from the basting line again. But this time we're just taking off the top layer. So here is our finished Starburst block.